Hi and welcome. I'm Steve Martirano, and this is the Behavioral Corner. You're invited to hang with us as we discuss the ways we live today, the choices we make, the things we do, and how they affect our health and well-being. So you're on the corner, the Behavioral Corner. Please hang around a while. Hey everybody, how you doing? And welcome to the Behavioral Corner once again. You find me, your host and guide, Steve Martirano, on the corner. It's great being a host and guide to a show that pretends to be on a street corner because there's not much guiding that has to be done. We're here on the corner and we talk about everything that affects behavioral health, which is a big area to discuss. Behavioral health it covers areas of choices that we make, the way we live. All of it affects our emotional, psychological, and spiritual well-being. So that's what we do, and we hope you're it's catching on with you guys. Before I get to my guest, I just want to take a moment to remind you what really works for us. Like really, our lifeblood here is feedback. So I just want to pause for a moment, remind folks, if you find us, the site's behavioralcorner.com. You can hear the podcast anywhere, particularly iTunes. If you write a review, that would be fantastic. And everyone likes to hear praise, but we're looking for honest evaluation of what we do. Okay, behavioralcorner.com, and that's where we are. All right, let's get to it because it's an important topic we're going to discuss on the corner today, and it has to do with policing in this country. I'm a child of the 60s. It's no stranger to me to see clashes or controversies or actual violence between police and the communities they serve. Going back to the early days of the civil rights movement when I was very young, and certainly the anti-war movement and political turmoil back in the 60s brought all these up. Our cities in the 60s, as you all know, were often battlefields. And recently, of course, George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis has reminded us tragically once again that the divide that often exists between police and the communities they serve is almost always been with us, and seems to be getting wider. I don't know. I hope not. But that's what we're going to talk about: policing in this country and the challenges of that very, very difficult job. We're gonna do it here on the corner from the police perspective, from that side of it. But I dare say we'll get a perspective on both sides. But we wanted to go to the other side of the divide here and talk to an active police officer. Wil Altera has been a police officer for over a decade now, 12 going on 12 years, 10 for the Stanford, Connecticut Police Department. And he joins us on the Behavioral Corner. Wil, thanks for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
You're a youngin'. I'm a little bit older than you, a little bit more than a little bit older than you. But you know the history of conflict in the cities of this country, and the police are always on the front line. When you got into, well, first let me ask you, what was it that attracted you to law enforcement?
I every time I'm asked this question, it always takes me back to my high school days. My father asked me what I wanted to be, what I wanted to do with my life. And I told him I wanted to be in some form of law enforcement, whether it be on a federal level with the FBI, or an attorney, or a police officer. And he scoffed. His response, he scoffed at the idea of me being a police officer because in his eyes, he didn't feel like it was a professional enough job or career for somebody to go to college and then come and do. But once I, fast forward a few years later, once I actually decided to do it and I graduated from the police academy, he came down and saw, they had a video of a synopsis of what we went through. They did a nice ceremony and all that. And he was blown away at how professional it really was. And it was the first time that I could see it in his face and his eyes, that how proud he was of me. So it was back then I had, what if you could call it a calling to law enforcement. It's something that I've always wanted to do. And the biggest thing that attracted me to this job this field is the camaraderie aspect of the job. I'm big into sports. I played football as in high school, a little bit in college, and I wanted to be a part of something that I could be part of a team.
Mhm.
You know what I mean?
Mhm.
So I felt like being in a locker room with the guys. When I say guys, I mean the men and women together.
Sure.
Um, this was a kind of career job field that could give me that sense of team, atmosphere. And I had that for, when I was a kid, if you will, and having it again in this setting was something that I longed for. And that was the biggest part of what
Mm.
attracted me to law enforcement.
It's your father's initial feelings
Yeah.
about law enforcement as a career path for you is not uncommon. I mean, even today, I don't think most people think of police as professional in the way they think of a lawyer who is a professional, or even an accountant who is a professional. They think of law enforcement in some other way. You can certainly understand your father going, well, that's not a career. That's,
Yeah.
and that's, it's been 10 years, and that attitude still prevails. Has it ever occurred to you that while it's not true, and your dad saw it, he saw your training, he was proud of it, he knew it was a serious job you were entering into, but does that attitude that in general, people don't have a notion of police as professionals make your job even harder?
Yeah, I would say so. People's preconceived notion of what it is we do is a big part of why the climate is the way it is today. You know what I mean? Because them feeling a certain way or assuming that this is a certain way that things go leads them to feel the way that they do, because they have, everybody has a right to their opinion, but sometimes your opinions are not fact and they're incorrect. And sometimes I think for us as members of the law enforcement and, police departments need to put out more, like using social media and other avenues to open the doors so people can see exactly what it is. Not exactly, you know what I mean? To get more familiar with what it is that police, do.
Well, I think I was trying to articulate what I think your father was thinking, and I'm not talking about people who have an active animosity towards the police. I'm talking about most people. I think most people look at police officers and say, well, you know why they're police officers? Because somebody gave them a badge and a gun, and they got a patrol car, and they're cops. That's what they do. They don't think of it as like, is this guy trained well, and is this a career path? Is he going to do the, lots of other times we think, well, they came out of the military and they like the military, now they're cops, right? So there's this disconnect. So when you began your career, I'm fast. I have a couple of attitudes about what may be problematic with police. One of the things I have in my mind is, what's the training like from start to finish? Will, how long did it take you to become a police officer?
Wow. It from the day that you put the application in, it's a long process. It could take a few months to a couple of years just to get hired. Now, once you're hired, you're sworn in. You have to go through the initial application process. You have to do a written exam, a physical agility exam, and then a psychological exam, as well as a lie detector. And this is the way that we do it here in the state of Connecticut. It may be a little bit different or even more so for different state. It runs state to state. It's not on the federal level. So here in Connecticut, those are the parameters that you have to go through just to be sworn in. You understand what I'm saying? So once you're sworn in, you enter the police academy, and the police academy itself is 6 to 9 months of training in the police academy. I entered in the police academy in February and graduated in July. So that was the time frame for me. So
So
that's
in July, you found yourself on the streets patrolling as an active duty police officer.
in July, I graduated from the
Then what
police
happened?
academy. Then, you know, you go to the police department and there's more training. There's, I believe it's 12 weeks of field training. So you are with, and you go through phase 1 through 4. And you're with different, you're with a different police officer for each phase. So and it may be a little bit different now
Mhm.
with the training, because my training was in 2009. So by the time I was done with that whole process, I was it was over a year of training. You know what I mean? From the time you get hired, and once you're finished with the academy, and then you get FTO. I would say no, maybe not a full year of training, but well, the training is never over. The training is ongoing. Like, I'm training still. You know, you have to do a specific amount of training every year, but the initial process from which you get hired, and then from the time you are done with FTO and you're fully a police officer on your own on the street, is just under a year, just about 9 to 10 months.
Wil Altera is a police officer with the Stanford, Connecticut Police Department. He's telling us about his training. I've always been fascinated by it because I look at what police are called upon to do very often, almost every day in this country, and I wonder how could they possibly have been trained correctly. And that has less to do with your training, I think. It has to do with what police are called upon to do. And we'll get into that in a second. But so that training obviously was valuable to you. But
Yes.
what has changed over your career, the course of your career, where you thought the training lacked? In other words, you weren't prepared for some of these things because the training for it was lacking. Does that make sense? Was there anything that you can think of?
I don't want to put it on the training itself, because there's a saying that goes with what we do is, there is no training in existence that can prepare you for some of the situations that you're going to run into. And that's very true. So you know, the training is kind of a baseline for the minimum amount of professionalism, force, or what have you, necessary to be certified as a police officer. But now, once you're in there, there's a lot of gray, and there's a lot of, you know, finagling you have to do to apply your training to a specific scenario. So in a lot of ways, there's no training for specific for, you know, there's a man outside waving around a chainsaw. You know what I mean? There's not a specific scenario for that specific, you know, there's not a specific training for that specific scenario. You have a baseline training how to deal with an emotionally disturbed person, whether he's carrying a chainsaw, whether he's just walking around in the street, you know, naked, and just, you know, speaking to himself, mumbling. You have a baseline of what you should do when you're approaching a person like that, you know?
So that raises the question of in terms of training police officers now. We have a mental health crisis in this country. There are lots and lots of people who are not in institutions, not getting any treatment, often not taking the medicine if they've been prescribed medicine for serious psychiatric problems. When there's a problem with that, it almost invariably falls on the police to get there first. And as you just said, you get lots of training for lots of things, but maybe not that. And that's something that you confront an awful lot, right?
Yes, it's actually on the rise in our city. I think, you know, it's safe to say all over the country with mental health issues. I think another thing to add to dealing with that is the fact that as a police officer, you know, you're not just a police officer when you're dealing with someone like that, because some of the roles that you play as a police officer, sometimes you're a teacher, sometimes you're a psychologist, sometimes you're a parent. You know, in certain circumstances, when you're dealing with a child, a teen, an adult, an elderly person, depending on what the situation is. Sometimes you play a different role. You're not just a police officer, you're playing a role of a psychologist or a teacher or something else, you know?
Will, is that too much to ask of a police officer to be all those things?
I think I wouldn't say it's too much to ask. I think when you become a police officer, it's something that you should expect. You know, that there's going to be a lot asked of you to deal with the community, because as a police officer, it's almost impossible to just play cops and robbers or, you know, doing traffic stops. There's a lot of, you know, you're just playing the middleman to a civil dispute between neighbors. You know what I mean? And it has nothing to do with the actual law enforcement or any criminal activity. You're just trying to calm down an argument between two neighbors over leaves on somebody's property. You know what I mean? These are things that have nothing to do with actual law enforcement, but as a police officer, you play a role in that. Sometimes that's what the day calls for. That's what the job calls for that day, or that in that moment, in that hour. You know?
It's another irony of police of criticisms of the police that you can hear. And again, I'm not talking about the hardcore, you know, get rid of the police crowd. I'm talking about, you know, your garden variety complaints, and that is, as you say, a domestic dispute breaks out. Maybe there hasn't been any violence yet, but the neighbors are complaining about the noise, and so they call the police. And then the police get there. Maybe sometimes they're not prepared to handle that, and then the police get criticized for letting it get out of hand. Maybe somebody gets hurt. So, do you agree or don't you agree that the community, as well as the media, certainly has to get a better handle on what they expect the police to do? I mean, you see on the side of every police car, to what, serve and protect. Okay. And now you're talking about being a mother, you know, being a counselor, being a psychiatrist, being a referee. Do we expect too much from the police? Do you think the communities expect too much from the police?
I wouldn't say, generally speaking, I wouldn't say that. I just think that there's a lack of understanding from the community with their expectations of police. You know what I mean? Like, having the expectation of the police to protect and serve, all that stuff falls underneath that umbrella, in my opinion. But where the disconnect is the criticism and the expectations from the community, certain members of the community, is, you know, expecting, you know, results, or not doing too much or too little. It's not black and white. It's not easy. It's not black and white. There's a lot of gray, like I said, in the things that we do, and in a lot of things, the way we have to handle certain situations. And I think if people were open to really understanding what it is we do, I think they would get a better understanding. So in a way, yes and no, to answer your questions. Does the community expect too much of law enforcement? I think in some aspects, yes, and in some aspects, no.
Yeah. And so that confusion, that tension, has led in many communities to a lack of trust. There's just a sense that police are almost a necessary evil. I think in some of our, you know, poorer neighborhoods, you know this better than anybody, where crime is very high, the people who live in their communities certainly don't want the police to go away. But that doesn't mean they trust them a whole lot. How can police and communities come together and build that trust?
I think, honestly, I think it's just open dialogue, and not just open dialogue, because everybody has something to say. Everybody has an opinion, but when you're giving that opinion, the other side, the opposite side, has to be willing to listen. You know what I mean? So I think the only way things will get better is for dialogue, and that means equal parts speaking and equal parts listening. You know, because if you have a lot to say and you're not listening, you're just venting, and you're not really gaining anything from the interaction.
Yeah, the only interaction people have with police is during a crisis, and it's never about communication. It's about something bad's going on.
And that's very true. Like a lot of the times, and some to what people don't understand is that when the police are finally, involved in whatever situation it is, you're typically dealing with a person who's probably having a rough time or the worst day of their life. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So
Mhm.
it's not you're there for a negative situation. I mean, with fire and EMS, they're there to rescue. You're kind of feeling relieved, when they're there on scene, like hurry up, come. They're waving you to
Mhm.
please
Mhm.
come help my mother. She's having a heart attack, or whatever the case may be. But for us, we're not always welcomed in the situation. It's always it's always a negative situation. So it's difficult to in that moment, during that incident, to have the open dialogue. And I think that it takes a little bit more effort to get to the point where you can have that the mending between the community and police. You have to
Yeah,
have it not in the during an incident.
it has to be there when you get there. It has to already have been there. So, so let me. And what's going on very often in very many communities in this country is that the police are no longer viewed by a large number of people, particularly the communities of people of color, as a public servants to serve and protect, but as an occupying army. These are sort of people. They've got a lot of equipment, they got a lot of armor, they got a lot of weapons. Our neighborhoods are, you know, sometimes scary, but when you show up, it's not reassuring. It's sort of, it almost adds to the threat of the lives they live. It's a tension-filled thing. Are you now? I know you've got the okay to talk. Your commanding officers know you're making this um, podcast with us. But are police departments across the country facing a challenge here? How do they shift that attitude of you know in that sort of militaristic attitude and get people to recognize you guys as servants?
Well, the thing I say about that is I don't see what what is negative about the military. When people say that, oh, the police are too militaristic, I don't think that. I think people use that as a negative connotation towards members of police. But to me, I don't see that when you talk about the military, I don't think of them as something negative. So to compare us to the military shouldn't be seen as something negative. You know what I mean? I understand with what you mean towards, like, on home soil, on community, like, well, seeing them as a little aggressive or intimidating. But with a lot of the things that we deal with, we could use that sense of force, our presence of being intimidating, to our advantage. Because if you're up to no good, I'll use myself as an example. If I'm up to no good,
All
and
right.
and I have the intention of committing a crime, and I see what is described to be as a militaristic presence in front of me, I'm less likely to go through with that. You know what I mean? So in a sense, that's why we train hard. You're supposed to keep your physique up and do all those things. I think in many senses, just because you look a certain way doesn't mean that you can't be also a calming figure, like
Well, you
in a
calming is one
dispute.
thing. Calming is one thing. I see. I would appreciate that, but intimidating is another.
Yes.
And there is something that intimidate. It certainly would intimidate me if police responded to something in my neighborhood um, with some of the stuff I've seen. Half tracks and SWAT teams with armor and helmets, and that. I understand that there are situations that call for that kind of response. But in general, I think it has driven a wedge at some of the communities who view you guys not as the cavalry coming to rescue, but this invading force. It's probably, listen. Clearly, it is not the entire truth, but it certainly has contributed to the sense of dread about police and the amount of force they
And
can use.
and
Go
I
ahead.
think there's just a lack of understanding when it comes to that, because what I have when I'm wearing my uniform is necessary for my safety. If I'm wearing a vest, an outer carrier vest, and my gun belt, and these are the things necessary for me to execute my job, and at the same time for me to stay as safe as possible. Yes, there are situations where, for crowd control, I may have to wear the heavy duty stuff with the helmet and the shield and things like that. But the situation dictates that level of force necessary
Mhm.
for that
No,
specific
I appreciate
situation.
that. I can certainly appreciate that. Will, as a police officer, and obviously as a man of color, you saw George Floyd killed.
Yes,
What did you think of that? As you watched that, what did you think of
it was shocking in nature, and the first thing I thought was, it's unfortunate that it's a reason for the communities to have a sense of distrust towards us, and that's what I thought that day. And when I first saw it, I immediately thought that it's very difficult for someone to look at a police officer and differentiate between the good police officer and the bad police officer, because we're all wearing the same uniform. So when you see a man kill someone like that, it kind of, you can't blame society for feeling that way, even though the statistics and the numbers prove opposite of what the climate of what the society is saying about us right now. You know what I mean?
No, I don't. What do you mean?
Well, statistics show that more often than not, we're doing the job correctly, the way we're supposed to do it. There's very few bad apples within us, within the ranks of the police, that actually act out and do things like that.
Oh, I
You know what
agree
I
with,
mean?
I
But
agree with,
they,
yeah, I agree with that completely. But let me ask you
but
something. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
but when you see something like that, in these times with body cameras and cell phone cameras and things like that, it's hard for someone, just the average citizen, to think, to see a police officer and not know, well, is he the good guy or the bad guy, because they all wear the same uniform. And that's initially what I thought. It's just,
Yeah.
it's going to be harder for people to trust us, because we have a certain level of license to use force necessary for a specific situation. But are you going to be the police officer that uses excessive force? You know what I mean? So there's no way for an average person to differentiate that. They just have to be able to trust, and it's hard for them to trust just any police officer after seeing something like that.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the question is, can professional police forces afford even one bad apple? Well, this bad apple thing is not going down with a lot of people anymore. Chris Rock had a very insightful, he made a joke, but it was incredibly insightful. He said, you don't hear an airline say, most of our pilots can land the airplanes. Now, we got a couple of bad pilots that crash into mountains. You don't hear it. You don't hear doctors saying, well, we got a couple of bad apples. But the police seem to want to excuse the behavior that resulted in George Floyd dying as an example of, well, that's the bad apple. How can there be an apple that bad in a police department and not have people go, what's going on?
Well, they, unfortunately, you're right about that, but it's the reality of what we live in. The system isn't perfect. The hiring system, it's very rigid. In order for me to be in the position that I'm in, I've had to go through countless examinations, aptitude tests with the written test, verbal, several verbal interviews with different members of the board and also the administration,
Yeah.
psychological exam, psychiatric exam, a lie detector test. You know, all these officers have to go through that, and it's not a foolproof, a fail-proof system. Unfortunately, there are people that start off normal and, you know, competent people who, you know, after a couple of years of being exposed to different things, they deal with certain traumas differently than other people. So
And I agree. Yes.
it's not always that the person that you hired is a bad person.
Yeah.
They just become it. You know what I mean? And sometimes you do hire a bad person. They just slip through the cracks.
No,
Unfortunately,
I don't really
that's just how it is.
Will, I don't think it's a question. Sometimes the wrong person is hired, but
Yes.
I don't think that's the problem. The problem is the job is stressful. It's one of the most difficult
Absolutely.
jobs. Yeah, it's one of the most difficult jobs we ask anybody to do. It's inconceivable to me that someone would, well, it's not inconceivable, but it's very difficult for me to understand the motivation of somebody like yourself who's willing to get up every day and go into the worst situations, because I don't want to have to deal with them, but you do it. That you pay a price for that. Police pay a price for that. I wonder if you think after 12 years as a professional law enforcement officer, that you as, I don't mean you, but as a group, are getting the kind of support you need, psychological support. We know about suicide rates and drinking problems and divorce among police. The numbers are terrible. Do you think you guys are getting the kind of support you need for a very stressful job?
In the past, no. I think now with more research and I think people, you know, who have the power to implement all these things, I think they're starting to see that it is very necessary to you know, cater to some of the psychological mental health needs that we all need. And I mean, just putting a citizen or a council member or, you know, what have you, through a scenario, they always look at us and like, how do you guys deal with this stuff? And it's just like, exactly, you know, you have to be able to have avenues to take care of yourself physically and mentally. I think more so mentally than it's more important than ever before. And yes, I think now you're starting to see the support there, because with my town, my city, we have the peer group, which is a group of officers who are, you know, within the ranks, whether they are patrolmen, sergeant, lieutenant, captain, they're part of the peer group who you can turn to. You can call them and let them know that you're having an issue, and, you know, they can do their best to help you out. You can lean on them for emotional support, mental support. And also with that, you have the EAP, which is a service that's outside of the department, where you can get on the phone and call a psychologist and schedule someone, and you could set up to meet with a therapist on a routine basis, or just to, you know, go through what you're going through and help guide you with that. And
yeah,
you know,
those EPAs are very, very important. And hopefully we have a generation of police officers who avail themselves of it, because as you know, sometimes it's a question of, no, you know, man up, just get out there.
I was going to say that too. And it's not also that there's a lack of support from our administrations or the cities and the states that we work for, but it's also, there's a sense from ourselves, like, you should be able to handle this stuff. Yes. You signed up to do this stuff, and, you know, there's a little bit of, you know, well, if I go and call a therapist, then that means something is wrong with me. There's a little bit of taboo that comes with that, and you feel like as a police officer you shouldn't need that, but that's actually incorrect. You should take advantage and use that to, you know, because, you know, at the end of the day, you are a human being, and constantly being exposed to those traumas will have an impact on you. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but sometime down the line it will.
Absolutely. Wil Altera is with the Stanford Police Department. He's been in law enforcement for 12 years. And we're trying to get a perspective from that side of the equation. Well, we talked a little bit about the bad apple, getting, cops who wind up doing the wrong thing, sometimes with deadly consequences. Sometimes they're just bad cops and they don't hurt anybody, but they don't help anybody. Whenever a situation like that arises, almost more than any group in society that I can think of, there is a knee-jerk reaction to a perceived attack on police that results in what we refer to as the blue wall, circling the wagons, and protecting bad cops. Is that a problem?
I don't, yes, it is, but I don't think that's the goal. The goal is when you put up the quote unquote blue wall is to protect what you have, which is, the law enforcement workforce, you know what I mean? Because as a whole, we are a collective group of men and women who chose to do a job for many different reasons, for whether it be for the benefits or because you want to help people, or like myself, you want to be a part of a team atmosphere. There's so many great men and women who do this job, and it goes without notice. But as soon as something bad happens, that's what's illuminated, and the spotlight is on that more so than the day-to-day. Because from whatever, let's say from the George Floyd situation till now, how many situations where a police officer had to go and make an arrest there have been? Obviously there's been a few of them that have gone bad, and you see videos and all that stuff come out, but there are thousands and thousands of police interactions every day that you never hear about because they go right. You know what I mean? So there's always a spotlight on the mistakes or the bad things that come
Yes.
from a police interaction.
Yeah, that's true.
But
The
spotlight is mainly on that.
Yeah, that's true about a lot of things. I mean, yes, you're right. There are thousands and thousands of police interactions that we never hear of because nothing dramatic happens. But when someone dies, we do. Thousands of airplanes take off and land. We don't hear about those, but the one that crashes, we do. So the margin of error is narrow. I get that. Let me just ask a few more questions about this idea of this not unwillingness, but hesitancy to weed out the bad cops in a public way. I understand that camaraderie, the unit matters. I get all that, but not at the expense of people potentially getting hurt. So you're a union. You think police unions are part of the solution to the problem of policing and not part of the problem. Is that right?
Well, what do you mean by that?
I mean, what are unions? Are unions protecting bad cops, do you think?
No, I don't think so, because the way the way it's set up now is, if you do something that violates somebody's constitutional rights and it's clear as day, you're not going to have the backing of a police department or a city. You're going to be on your own to defend yourself legally, to defend yourself in the court of law. But if you do something that that doesn't have the goal, or the absolute it's escaping me, but it's not intentional. Like, it's not intentional that you went to violate somebody's constitutional rights or to harm another person in some way, then you're going to have the backing. Like, an example is that of this is, like, if I'm going lights and sirens to a call and I get into a car accident on my way to the call, that's not something that's intentional that happens, that I should be, prosecuted for.
Sure.
I should, and that's something, depending on the circumstances, the speed limit, and what the situation was. The union is going to fight for me and back me in a situation like that. But if I do something like what Derek Chauvin did, they're not going to protect you. If you violate the policies and procedures of your police department and also the state, what they legislate for us to do, they're not going to fight you. And
Then
it's
you're on
always
your,
been that.
then you're on your
Yeah,
own.
it's always been that way. It's not something new.
Mhm. Let me, I'm going to sum up here now. You see yourself continuing law enforcement for many more years, I would take it, right?
Yes.
What are you hopeful about going forward?
It's difficult because it is a difficult time to be a police officer, and I see the new recruits that come in, and I'm just I'm happy to see that somebody is willing to come into this career field during these times, but at the same time, I also think, man, you're gonna have it tough, kid. But what I hope for is that things just get better, that there's more of a understanding, more of a healing between the community and police, because obviously there's a disconnect there, so I hope that, and I honestly believe that with time you will start to see more and more what we really are about and what it is that we do. And hopefully, members of the community, as you see crime is rising right now, they'll, I understand that you see us as a necessary evil, but I hope that you can, with time, that you could see that we're not evil. We're just a necessary part of society.
Yeah, well, the police have to be part of the solution.
Yes, absolutely.
They have to be part of the solution. They cannot be part of the problem. And you're right, the community and the police have a responsibility to make sure that happens, that police solve our problems.
And to further that, the police and the community isn't two separate things. In a lot. The police is part of the community, because the police when you take off the uniform, you're still a police officer who can act in a felony situation depending on where you are. But we are members of the community as well. We want to see good cops doing the right things every day, because we're also husbands, wives, daughters, sons, cousins, grandparents. We're in the schools. Our kids go to the same schools as other people, and we're in churches, and we're part of the community. So of course we want to be part of the solution.
It's great to remind people of that, because they think of you guys and you women as those people in the uniforms with the guns and the batons, and you're way more than that. Wil Altera, thanks so much, Wil. We want to talk more about this going forward. We hope we can have you and maybe some of your fellow officers join us from time to time, because as I said, there are problems for sure, but it's not an easy job. And anybody who thinks it is kidding themselves. You're to be congratulated for your service, obviously. And thanks for joining us on The Corner. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Take care.
Studies show that 2020 has negatively affected the mental health of millions of Americans. That is why at Retreat, we work to provide comprehensive mental health programming through our Synergy Health programs. To learn more about Synergy and the comprehensive mental and behavioral health services we offer, call us today at 855-802-6600.
That's it for now. And make us a habit, hanging out at the Behavioral Corner. And when we're not hanging, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter on the Behavioral Corner.